Hello, everyone. I put this together a few years ago um, in trying to figure out, how do you teach Passover? And it's like with most things, it was actually to teach me about Passover because my childhood, I'd go to Passover seder, and my father would lead the whole thing. Everyone wouldn't listen to him and be yelling and screaming, and laughing and throwing food. And they don't really teach you Passover in rabbinical schools. I was like, how do I learn Passover? So I put this thing together to try to understand it. Um, and I would say, of all of the holidays we do, at least the latest studies that I saw years ago, Passover is the most celebrated Jewish holiday in all of Judaism. Most people, like if I took a vote, they'd say, "Oh, it's got to be Yom Kippur, it's got to be Rosh Hashanah, maybe it's Hanukkah." It's not. This one takes first slot. And I think part of that is that it's a home holiday. Hanukkah is too, but it's a home holiday, brings people together. There's food, there's discussion. I would also say, as we get into this, and we're going to look at, and I'm going to try to go as fast as possible because I know people love staring at Zoom. But because it's the most celebrated of all of the holidays, I would also say it's the thing that actually changes the way Jews react and think and act in the world. Because it really is it's designed thousands of years ago to be incredibly relevant for the day that you're in. So if you're in 2021, it should be relevant to 21. If it's written in 1923, it should be relevant then. So of all of the books Jews have published throughout, we'll call it 2,000 years, no book has been published more than the Haggadah. The Haggadah is what we actually kind of carries us through. It's the guide to it. So it's not like there's one version. There are literally thousands of versions. Even since the Middle Ages, we've added thousands more versions. There'll be new ones coming out this year, and there's always new ones because we're trying to figure out how do you make this relevant. So when we look in here, you first have to kind of start on the really high level of trying to understand what is Pesach, what is Passover. And if I say really basic right there, the most basic thing we're doing is we're just trying to commemorate what happened in Egypt. Okay, trying to tell a story, trying to remember this. And in there, we're going to kind of hit these high themes throughout there, but it's not just telling the story. You're going to see what we're trying to do is have people internalize this story and experience it no other way. So we're talking about celebrating freedom. We're creating memory in that process. And it's this constant communal reminder of who we are. One of a story I like to share is that when my daughter was, maybe she was 3, I think, she was really sick of all the matzah. We were like on day 5. She's like, "You've got to be kidding me. Why are we doing this?" I go, I go, we're doing this because we were slaves in Egypt. She looks at me, she goes, "You were slaves in Egypt?" I go, no, like we weren't slave. Our ancestors, they were slaves in Egypt. She goes, "Zaidi," that's her grandpa, "Zaidi was a slave in Egypt?" I go, no, not Zaidi, like long time ago. But we were, and she looks at me very like, doesn't really understand. And here's me. But what's interesting is that I spoke in the we. It wasn't they, it was we. And that's how I was trained to speak. And I didn't even notice it until literally a year later. And I kid you not, I see her in the other room talking to her little brother and explaining Passover to him. And she says to him, "We eat the matzah because we used to be slaves in Egypt." And so you could see literally within 1 year that idea was internalized. And so what we're doing in this is that we are creating those kind of memories, and we're trying to make it so it's an internalized stories that people experience and understand, and it changes their perception and how they view the world. And so the way we do this is that when I talk about the Haggadah, that word, the deconstruction of the word itself is very revealing of what we're doing because it comes from that root neged. Because normally, I'm going to sit around, I'm going to tell a story, but it's not really just telling a story. What you're doing is, you can see right here in this definition, it literally is to push against. Okay? You're questioning and you're challenging and you're creating almost a tension with other people. So if you ask, I would say almost every year someone goes, "Okay, Rabbi, tell me the best way to do a seder, or what's the best Haggadah?" That's the best one. Like if I took like 10% of all the Haggadahs I recommended, I still probably wouldn't have much money, but it would be a new business I could go into. But I would say the best seder that you could have is that you would sit down and you wouldn't get through a single page of the Haggadah. It would actually be a discussion where you're challenging and asking ideas which are relevant for the generation and the age groups that are at that table. So I was lucky enough. I was really lucky. When I was a rabbinical student, I think a rabbi got sick and they needed a rabbi for a cruise ship. I don't know why they thought they needed a rabbi for a cruise ship for Passover, but the cruise industry decided they needed that. It was like 3 days later, 3 days till Passover. So my wife and I, we threw our hand up. We'll go. We went to this cruise, and it was in the Caribbean. And the seder we had, we barely got through the Haggadah. Rather, what we did is that since we were in the Caribbean and we're having this luxurious, wonderful time, we actually talked about the slavery and the oppression that actually existed right there in the Caribbean and made that part of where we were. And it became this really powerful experience to say, look, here's where we are. How does this relate to today? And you're going to see as we go back and forth throughout this, we're going to look at, what happened in the past, but you always should be pushing it forward to what's in the present. And if you get into an argument, a respectful argument, that is fantastic. That's actually what you're supposed to do. I will tell you, every year I have an argument with my sister-in-law about politics in Israel and how it relates to oppression. It's become our tradition. We kind of laugh at it at this point, but it's relevant and it keeps it alive. And we talk about how things change and where we're trying to go here. So the way we do this is through creating rituals throughout the entire service. And so the Seder itself, it literally is just an order. It's like if I said, okay, we need to get, if you remember the old MapQuest directions, remember like before you had smartphones, you would sit there and you would type into MapQuest and you'd print it out and you'd have these pieces of paper in your car. And it would be like step 1, 2, and 3. That's all you're trying to do here. There are these steps which you're actually trying to get through the service. Okay, that's the first thing. And we'll look at what the order is. Okay, it's to kind of remind you, you're at point A, you're going to point Z. Next thing, you don't eat bread. Okay, not allowed to. Part of the experience. Also why my daughter asked the question of like, ugh, enough of this matzah here. And not only you're not supposed to eat bread, but you're supposed to eat matzah. Now, part of that is that when you're eating the matzah, you're trying to have that internalized experience of, wow, this is what it must have tasted like. I have like a little taste and I'm a little closer. It's not this distant story, but it's something that I'm internalizing. So when we look at the Seder, at the very beginning, you start off with actually chanting through this order, okay? And I'll go, there's the Kadesh, and we're going to roll through these. I'll go quickly through all of them, but you'll see this literally is like the beginning of it. I don't know if you've seen, there's this comedian, she gets up and she literally tells you how the comedy show is going to go. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I'm going to say. You're going to think this is funny. You're going to cry here. And we're going to end there. And she kind of lays it out. And this is what we're going to do in 60 minutes. And we do the exact same thing, laying out exactly where we're about to go. And so the very first stage of it is Kadesh. It's literally creating this sanctification. Now, you pour your glass of wine and you prepare for it. Now, the reason why the wine is drunk is that throughout this, when we're talking about trying to internalize these experiences, the rabbis, when they design the Seder, they recognize that there are different learners. People learn differently, okay? Some people are very intellectual. Other people do better by storytelling. And they're going to try to hit you on different modalities of learning throughout the entire service, okay? For adults, why are we giving you wine, not 1 glass, but 4 glasses? We're trying to get you drunk. We're literally trying to change your perception of the world. Because in Judaism, we think of wine and we associate it with joy. And the thought is, if I can start here at the beginning, which is the dark part of the service, okay, we're going to talk about how terrible it was and painful it was. And if I can finish with 4 glasses, an entire bottle of wine for you, okay, and make it good wine. Don't do Manischewitz, even though my mother thinks that's the best wine in the world. By the end, you hopefully are feeling light and free and excited and joyful. And that's what we're trying to take this journey as we go through there. Now, inside there, I think you can almost think of this as like a Broadway play a little bit. Like you're creating this setting in the beginning. is at the beginning of this thing is that you wash your hands. Now, if you're in a traditional household, okay, and you wash every single meal, which you would do, you'd sit there, you'd say the blessing, and then you'd wash your hands, then you'd say the blessing, okay? Standard operating procedure. And there's little things which we're going to throw in here for the rabbis put in there to kind of make you go, huh, weird. That's a little bit different. Is that right here? You do the blessing, but you actually, hold on, I skipped a slide up. Let me go back. You wash your hands, but there is no blessing. So that's different. So it should stick out to a person. And usually a person would be like, they'd be ready to say the blessing, ready to eat, and we're not there yet. So instead, we immediately move to this karpas. And this is how it's like a Broadway play, is that if I think about the karpas, it's that green. Think about Mount Tam right now. It's gorgeous. If you have not been there recently, go there. It is the best time of the entire year on Mount Tam. The flowers are out, the green is out. It is filled with life. And so there's kind of this joyful thing, but we don't actually just leave it there, is because we juxtapose that green and that life with salt water, which is just odd. But if you think about salt water, you dip it in there, this thing which is life, and you talk about tears. And you're starting to get this hint. It's like this scary music in the background. And this is not all so happy. This is actually, there's pain involved in this. And we're going to juxtapose those two experiences as we go forward here. You say the blessing and you move forward. Now, you then take the matzah and you snap it in half. And you're going to take this one piece, you're going to put it aside to hide it for the afikomen. And this is like hypothetically, if anyone's kids get bored during a service, which I know no one's kids minus mine ever do, and they're like, oh my God, when is this going to end? This is meant to be a thing which is kind of leading up and the build up to the end, is that I'm actually not able to finish the service until I get that piece of matzah. So, oh, I skipped ahead. So I hide that afikomen away. We'll come back to it. But it's kind of getting people ready to be, just like I told you what the order is going to be. Now I'm not only telling you the order, but I'm telling you the fun game that's going to come later on in the service to kind of keep people entertained and engaged throughout there. If you have other ways of keeping people engaged in your service to make it authentic for where you are, it's exactly what you're supposed to do. We have, in my parents' house, we have like little tchotchkes, like little tiny toys that people play with, like darkness and this and that and frogs, and we throw stuff around and like what the kids do. And we've changed the service as the kids have changed age. When they were younger, we would not really we would minimize the actual sitting and reading the service. Instead, what we would do, we would take the kids in the backyard and we would escape Egypt. And there was someone dressed as Pharaoh and they would kind of experience and they would celebrate. And that's how we would do it, because it was, it was very real world acting and they loved it and they got it that way. They're older now. So now we're moving more into this modality of learning, which moves you to number 5, which is really beginning to tell that story. And people here may know the Ma Nishtana Halayla Hazeh. It's just a way to it's asking this question of, why is this night different from all other nights? And it's trying to spur a conversation. Okay. It's a nice tradition to do, but if you can add other things in there to spur that conversation, I can't implore you enough that is actually what we're trying to do. That's why we keep on rewriting the Haggadot over time. So we go through there, and through it's this question and answer, like, how is this different? Here's why it's different. Why do we eat this? Here's why we eat it. And it's beginning to reveal that story in the process. You then do your second cup of wine. You're preparing for it. You're getting ready for it. Here are the 4 questions which you're asking as you go through there. And then finally, you get to the part which, if you remember earlier, when we washed our hands and didn't say anything, we get to the part where we're actually going to wash our hands and say the blessing. You do the blessing over the bread. You can see it starts moving fairly quickly. And then right after you do the blessing of the bread, you eat the matzah. And then you quickly go from tasting that idea of like the matzah, oh, that's freedom. And then you switch from being freedom to switch to how do I internalize or understand something which is bitter and difficult, especially as like a California Jew? What do I know that's difficult? I mean, I've had a pretty cozy life. And so we take this thing as which is something which is bitter and like we're going to feel something which it hurts intentionally. So a tradition I have with my brother-in-law, and I don't know if I recommend this for anybody, but we've done it so long we continue to do it, is that we get this dry stuff right here, not the wet stuff in a jar. It's too easy. Doesn't hurt that much. The dry stuff, oh, it's miserable. And so we stack it up like this high and we eat it, and it makes me cry. It is so painfully miserable. But the problem is every year I burn my tongue with that stuff and I can't really taste anything for 24 hours, but I'm a little competitive, so I have to win. But so you can have those things, and it's also shown the kid. And now we have kids joining us in the process of going through the misery and the pain of that. Now, with most things in Judaism, there's always a thing called a machloket, which is like a clash, a disagreement. And you'll have one camp of rabbis say, you're supposed to taste the sweetness. The other one says, no, you're supposed to taste the bitterness. Like the sweetness side is like, we're celebrating freedom. They go, you kidding me? We could have been free without the slavery. And so, listen, we have the same argument over how do you light the Hanukkah. On Hanukkah, we have the same argument about the mezuzah. There's one group that says the mezuzah should go up and down. The other one says it should go horizontally, yes. And of course, what direction does it go? 45-degree angles. Always choose the middle. Let both be right. And so you have the same thing happen here, that we're going to go bitter, we're going to go sweet, and then we do a thing called the Hillel sandwich, which is once again trying to find that middle ground, which is probably a great lesson to be teaching anyone in America in 2021. How do you find the middle ground?
Rabbi Bauer,
Yes.
I have a quick question.
Go for it. Sure.
When maybe I just don't know what it is, but a mortar, M-O-R-T-A-R, in the previous slide.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes, great question. So if I go back to the previous slide, right here. So the mortar literally is, as you're telling these stories, and thank you for saying that and reminding me, is that bitterness was for the bitterness of slavery. The sweet haroset, which you can find great recipes all over online, is like this sweet thing, but it's supposed to look like the mud which we built the bricks out of. So when you think of the pyramids and what held it together, it's supposed to look like that. And so it's a weird juxtaposition of like pain and sweetness, but even finding sweetness in the materials that you built with when you were in pain. So that is what that is right there.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So explain this right here. Now at the same time, part of that sandwich and part of that discussion was we used to do an offering at the temple in Jerusalem, not at 2 Lake Street. We don't do those anymore. But so they would do lamb, and then we replace that with haroset, since we don't do sacrifices at least in 2,000 years. At that point, we moved to the festive meal. It's like you kind of hit I want to say even more than the halfway point. And I'm not suggesting you eat gefilte fish out of a jar. Just look at that. You cannot put that up there. Disgusting. So you go to your festive meal. At that point, you're kind of stuck. You just can't do anything because you need to move on with the service, and you cannot move on without the afikomen. Now, so that's how I get the kids back. But at the same time, everyone's eating, and you can imagine all of this, the focus that you've had is kind of dispersed. Everyone left. And you can kind of activate this game of, listen, I don't know where the afikomen is. Now, when you broke it earlier in the service, go find a room in your house or somewhere where you can hide it. And whoever finds it, they get a reward. You can give them a Bitcoin. It's worth a lot now. So no, the kids don't really want crypto, not yet at least. So you can give them whatever you want to give them, if it's candy, if it's money, but it's really meant to be like this big scavenger hunt. And, it varies when they're younger. It's kind of everyone gets a trophy. As they get older, it gets a little more competitive, and one gets the money. But you got to decide when that is. So they come back, they bring in the afikomen, and then you move to the blessing after the meals, just like you're normally, if you're in a traditional household, you would do the blessing before the meal, you do the blessing after, and that's kind of where you are. You do your third cup of wine and you drink it. You pour the fourth cup simply to get ready, and then you set aside the cup for Elijah. Now, I think this is probably one of the more important parts of the entire service. Elijah is a prophet, and Elijah is the prophet that comes right before the Messiah arrives. Now, why that's so important is that it's part of this. If you think about that, we started the service in this idea of, oh, spring but sadness, pain and sweetness. And if you're going through this internal experience, and it's important, I forgot to say this earlier, but never in any Haggadah ever written in the history of Judaism has Moses ever been mentioned in a Haggadah. He does not exist. He does not matter. We do not talk about him. Because it's not about Moses, it's about us. The whole thing is meant to be in that first person common plural. This is our experience. And so as I'm going through that experience, I suddenly open the door and I say, look, Elijah's coming to get some wine. Now, what many people do is all the kids are looking at the cup and you kind of shake the table with your leg and they see the cup moving. They go, oh my God, I think I saw it move. You go, oh, maybe it moved. Maybe it was Elijah. But really, the larger story that this is saying is that Elijah comes when the Messiah is going to arrive. But Messiah, many rabbis and a lot of Judaism doesn't actually think of the Messiah necessarily as a person, but rather as a time. And so the time, messianic time, means that you have finally reached from the world as a utopia. It means if I've been talking about slavery to freedom, it means there's no more slavery. It means there is no more oppression. It means every beautiful possible thing you can imagine in the world has finally come. But it didn't magically happen. It actually becomes on our shoulders here, telling the story, saying, listen, I know what it's like to be a slave, therefore I have to act this way. And I can't stress enough how important it is to be telling that story in that first person common plural to kind of frame the way that we see the world, because it is the number one mitzvah in the entire Torah. So the number one commandment, and it doesn't rank them in the Torah. The only way you can tell it's the number one is that it is the most said commandment in the entire Torah. It's said 36 times that, listen, don't treat that person this way because we were slaves in Egypt. And so when you see someone who's homeless, you go, well, I know what it's like to be homeless because we used to be homeless. We used to be slaves in Egypt when we were homeless. I know what it's like to be stuck at the border and not being able to have freedom because we were slaves in Egypt. It's really meant to change and frame the way we look. And I think, and this is not written anywhere, this is just Ryan's analysis, is that if you look at Jews' voting patterns in the United States, it's not like any other group's voting pattern in the United States. As Jews have changed, and I'm talking en masse, their socioeconomic status, they, not all, but mass majority, continue to vote like the bottom members of society, which doesn't make any sense. Don't necessarily vote for their own self-interest. They vote as if they are slaves in Egypt. If you saw during the civil rights movement, many of the leading voices during the civil rights movements of the white people going to the South were Jews. They didn't know why they were there, just they felt compelled. It was a story which they connected to and they felt an obligation to. And I would argue that throughout this entire experience of Passover and during that week of saying, I know what it's like, I'm tasting it, I'm really trying to remember that that's what we used to do. It is framing and changing the way that we view the world and what our responsibility in the world is. That it's not just if we're doing well, because right now is a temporary moment and we know what it's like when we are unseen and we don't take up any space. So that's why Elijah's cup is so important. And you'll see it's going to, at the very end of the service, the final step, it all comes together to kind of complete the story. Any questions? We're going to keep going here. So from there, we move into Hallel, which is just singing psalms and praises. And now you think about, you're in your fourth cup of wine, and this is not like a little cup. This is meant to be a big cup. You're a little shepherd at this point, okay? So You're a little drunk, maybe a lot drunk. And that's kind of like where we've hopefully gotten the headspace to at that point. And so you finish the service right here, which is, and you've probably heard this if you've been to a seder, that the final line that you say is next year in Jerusalem, which is kind of the summary of the whole service. Because Jerusalem, and I put a picture here, which I probably shouldn't have put a picture of Jerusalem there, but Jerusalem, it's more than a place. Jerusalem is an idea. And so when the temple gets destroyed in the year 70, Jerusalem, it came from the word Yerushalayim, which is Ir Shalom, which is literally the city of peace, the city of wholeness. It is a utopia. Okay? Now, what we're able to do is when we can put our minds towards a place like Yerushalayim, not just the place, but the idea, because otherwise it'd be like, oh, that means I have to get the United flight to Tel Aviv next year? Great if you did, but that's not what they're saying. What it's saying is that next year we're going to be in this place of perfection. That's why Elijah came in. If all of us internalize this idea of that I'm the bottom member of society, and actually for a week I'm going to just experience it, and then I'm going to ask, what is my role in the world to change it? And who is struggling now? And I didn't mention that guy Moses because it was never about him. It was about me. And if we do it correctly, next year we will be in this place of utopia, this place of Jerusalem. So if you even think about, minus Emanu-El, because that's like a different Zionist story, but every other synagogue in the world is built architecturally facing east. So when you're praying for these huge concepts of peace in the world and no hunger in the world, you're doing it from a physical location facing the direction of perfection. And so you're always able to look at whatever state of reality you're in. And as Shimon Peres of blessed memory said, the greatest gift the Jewish people brought to the world was dissatisfaction. But you only can be dissatisfied when you can imagine something better than what you're in. And that's part of what this service is trying to do. And that's what you're trying to convey to kids from, the youngest age all the way up to college. And then as we get post-college and as you become an adult, the story should change. It shouldn't just be the same thing that you did 20 years ago, because you're probably thinking different. And when you're later in life, you should interpret this differently. It's meant to be this active, engaging experience, which is really making you examine your own story, the world story, and then what your role is inside that world story to try and change that. So with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing. And if people have questions, great questions.
Rabbi Bauer, I have a silly question. Is it historically accurate that Jews built the pyramids? The slaves of Jews built the pyramids?
Great question. Is it historically accurate? I cannot prove that we built the pyramids. I had my professor, Tamara Eskenazi, still teaches. She's a brilliant woman. If you ever see the Women's Torah commentary, probably one of the best commentaries out there, relatively recent. She challenges and says, listen, if we were never slaves in Egypt, which we might not have been, because I don't actually have the archaeological proof. The way I prove things academically, the way I prove things is that I have to have two source materials to prove that it ever happened. So the example I would give is if I have, Barack Obama explain what his administration was like. It was amazing. I did all these wonderful things. And then I asked Donald Trump, what do you think about what Barack Obama did? Oh, Obama was terrible. He did this, this, and this. Historically, what I know for a fact is that Barack Obama was president. All I can prove. So we have some things, usually when we get to the prophets, that's early enough where I actually have two textual sources to prove them. When I'm as old as Egypt, there's not two textual sources. I just have the stuff here. I can prove to you why I was in Egypt. Moses' name, Moshe, is Egyptian. I can tell you the dimensions of the tabernacle, which we have in the desert, which is talking about there, are actually the same dimensions that we find in Egypt of how they built their temple. So there's very clear understanding of Egyptian culture inside there, but I cannot prove we were there. So Dr. Eskenazi, what she says is, listen, if we were never slaves in Egypt, let's say we weren't, it's actually even more powerful that we as a people identify as slaves. Any other questions?
I have a question. When you had talked about how synagogues are usually built facing east, so as we're going through each of these steps, should we be facing east, or is that not? No, we don't. Okay.
No, each one of these steps, it really is meant to be the kind of this, you're just engaging in a story is really what you're doing. And telling that story and asking questions. And I really do mean it. If if you're in a seder and you actually end up having let's say you start at 6 p.m. and you finish at midnight and you never open the book because you're all discussing about oppression in the world and what is our role and what are the political challenges, you've nailed it. So I want the thing I would love for you to get, I would like you to feel more free form as you do this. Don't feel like, oh my goodness, I didn't do that one page. I won't say I'm going down, but you know what I mean? That people worry about those kind of things. And it was never the rabbi's intent. It was really meant to be a framework for this. It's a fantastic framework because it really is, I do mean it. It is trying to teach different modalities throughout the whole thing, which is why there's the tasting and the eating and the drinking and the storytelling and the hiding and the intellectual part. And usually it's doing all of it. It's like 4 different independent schools coming together in one of ways to teach. It's incredible. But I would just say, make sure it's relevant for today.
Rabbi, is there any inconsistency between the fact that there's a set, like you said, order of the actual Passover service?
Wait, can you say that again? I couldn't hear you.
Is there any inconsistency between the order of the seder and then the freewheeling open discussion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the order of the seder, it's trying to create a structure for you to walk through. And I would say 99% of people will walk through the whole thing. I think the danger is that danger is probably too extreme of a word. It is too extreme of a word, but the danger is that we do things that are rote and doesn't have meaning. And it's not trying to get to the e-car, like the true essence of what's trying to be accomplished inside this experience. So, will I walk through the whole Seder? Absolutely. I'm going to do every single step this year, no doubt. Am I going to try to figure out how is it relevant to the day and age that I live in, and what is my role and what is my kids' roles and how is that relevant to the discussions we're in? Yeah. And so I'm fine kind of going off track for a while.
I guess I asked the question because of the family dynamic that we have. We have one end of the spectrum, primarily the older parts of the family, really want to go through every single page, discuss every single page there, and literally from basically sunset till midnight, they're still davening, doing the whole, and the other one just can't wait to get out of there.
Yeah.
Those steps, we're trying to find a medium ground. I don't even know this year, the fact that we may not be able to do anything other than the Zoom Seder. It might be an issue anyway, but when we ever get together again, I just was looking for some guidance as far as following the order. Maybe your answer previously was a middle ground is what we have to come up with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the goal, is trying to find that middle ground inside there. And listen, there's a reason why I also say there's lots of different Haggadahs. So there is not a Haggadah. Some people say I have to use the Folgers Haggadah because apparently that came from Mount Sinai. But it really is meant to be more wide open than that, to make sure that it is engaging. Just like, I keep referencing the kids. I know not everyone has kids here, but there are little kids services. There's more adult services. And then a great website, if you're interested in, is ajws.org. They usually come out with great materials. It's American Jewish World Service every year that's really relevant, that you could throw inserts inside there. And they would have questions about, what are the struggles in the world today?
What was that site again?
ajws.org. Let me, I'm throwing out websites and God knows even if they have a guide this year, but usually they do. I'll put it in the chat here. Yeah. Judy, you're muted there.
Muted. I wanted to ask about the number of days. It's supposed to be 8 days, right? Well, I remember I grew up in a conservative home, but it was actually, some people may consider it even more orthodox, and we could kind of end it. I've heard different things about ending it, like on the 7th day, or just we went to like noon on the 8th day. And I just wanted to, have you heard different interpretations about the
Yes,
numbers of days?
I can tell you what it is. So
Thank you.
I'm going to contradict I'm going to show you how hypocritical I am in the middle of my answer. So it is a 7-day holiday, but we didn't really know when it began or when it ended in Israel. That was our main point. So if I'm in Israel, I'm doing 7 days. Therefore, we throw in an extra day just to be safe. But I have this amazing thing called the internet now. So I can actually see when it ends there, which is why a lot of Reform Jews just do 7 days. I always get my Zachary's or Patchy's pizza on the night of the 7th. But I do 2nd day Rosh Hashanah, which is the exact same thing. Go figure. Because I like to. But it is the same concept.
Well, in Israel, they don't. Well, yeah, there's something that they don't. They're saying, well, we're in Israel, so we don't need to do.
In Israel, there it's like the central time zone. They don't need to double check anything. They know it ended. They're there. They can see the sun. How do I know? And so that's really where it came from. It's just, you'll just find, there's older tradition. I mean, look, the conservative movement, it's when I first got smicha and I became a rabbi, I actually used to speak in the intro classes and people would ask me about status of Jews. They go, well, my mother's not Jewish, but my father is. Am I Jewish? I'm like, of course you're Jewish. The conservative movement doesn't see you as Jewish yet, but like, it's going to change in a year. I was certain about it. And the whole reason that it was only matrilineal descent was because there's no way for me to know who the father is. But now that there's a thing called a blood test, I can totally tell who the father is. But it's like the tradition that for some reason, hasn't changed among Orthodox, conservative, which I can't believe 15 years out that I'm still saying that there's differences between all of them. But there's some things that we just continue to do because it's tradition. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you everyone for being here. And I hope people, I guess my hope for you is that you have a deeply meaningful Passover experience. And then you figure out what that means for you and your family. And God, I hope we're not, we might still be on Zoom again. That was painful last year when we did a Zoom Passover. But I shouldn't complain because listen, we have Zoom. I can't imagine going through the 1918 pandemic without the tools that we have, because this has been pretty easy compared to what they went through. So we're very lucky. So I shouldn't kvetch, but I will. Good night, everyone. It was good to see you.